at Harvester retreats, and I remember one in particular, and I thought it was the finest retreat I had ever attended, and that the level of sharing between the men was unbelievably vulnerable. Women wouldn't believe it. They think that they're great at sharing, and indeed they are, but they are skeptical about men's ability to share. But I can tell you, when the men were together, I've never heard anything like the depth of sharing and vulnerability that went on. And needless to say, the power of the Holy Spirit was powerfully at work in the hearts of those men. And I followed up on some of them, and their lives have been transformed. So I just want to emphasize how worthwhile those Harvester retreats really are. By the way, to use an Irish word, they're great crack. I mean, it's great being together, but there is that serious side to them as well. Now, our topic this afternoon is resolving conflicts, interpersonal conflicts, but doing so in a Christian way. And I think that this is a very important subject for a number of reasons, but the one I want to emphasize is that the church exists, to quote St. Paul VI, in order to evangelize. You know that there were two universal callings at the Second Vatican Council, and they're interrelated, the call to holiness and the call to evangelize. And I say to people, you will not be holy unless you evangelize, but your evangelization will not be effective unless you're holy. Now, we can add in, as part of that effective evangelization has to be rooted in united, loving communities. And that is perfectly obvious in the New Testament. For example, in Acts chapter 4, verses 32 to 36, we read these words. The number of those who believed were one in heart and soul. And with great power, the apostles were giving their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. Now, do you notice what Luke is saying? Effective evangelization, effective testimony to the resurrection and the implications of the resurrection was rooted in the fact that those who were evangelizing were members of a loving and united community. And their words were the expression of that love, and they could point to the community as the icon of what they were talking about. If you want to see the good news in action, look at our Christian community. It's very different from the pagan ones, because we are all united. We have the same love. We all have the same mind as Jesus Christ. So this notion has inspired me for most of my adult life. I have a passion about it. I'm a member of a community in Dublin called the New Springtime Community, and it is a number one rule for us. We must be united. We must resolve all conflicts as soon as they arise. We must not let the sun go down on our anger, because the extent to which we are divided is the extent to which our evangelization will be ineffective. Now, that applies to all of us, whether a member of a family, of a parish, a prayer group, an organization. Of course, it's true at work as well, that we have to try and be united with people in mind and heart. Now, if you look at the scriptures, you will find that unity of mind and heart is not easy to establish or to maintain. Even the apostles struggled with this issue. And I just want to give two examples. In Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 to 16, Paul tells us how he challenged St. Peter. Now, he's challenging the boss. He disagrees with him. They have a conflict. When Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. I said to Cephas in front of them all, you are a Jew, and you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? So this was a big debate about circumcision, if I remember rightly. And Peter had fallen back on the Jewish way of doing things, and Paul felt that he was unfaithful to the gospel message. And he told him straight up, you're wrong, Peter. In Acts chapter 15, verses 36 to 41, we find Paul in another conflict. Actually, I think he had an abrasive personality because he seemed to fall out with lots of people. But anyway, it says in the text, and there arose a sharp disagreement so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. So it seems in that case they just agreed to differ and went their separate ways, as they say. But there were conflicts there under the surface, and I'm sure there were many others that we never heard about. Now, I want to switch now to Pope Francis. May I say, because I hear so many people criticizing him, I am a number one admirer of Pope Francis. I think he's fantastic. And it breaks my heart when I see people criticizing him and when they say he's not a true pope or he's not properly orthodox. Now, I'm going to be bold like St. Paul. I think that that's a load of rubbish. And I think the Holy Father is a great teacher. Now, in his apostolic exhortation, The Joy of the Gospel, which is a delight to read, he has very interesting words to say about resolving conflicts in paragraph 227. Maybe you've missed this if you read the document. I'm more or less quoting him word for word here. Firstly, some people simply look at conflict and go their way as if nothing happened. They wash their hands of it and get on with their lives. Now, I call this the way of avoidance. I'm just going to avoid the problem. Then he says, number two, others embrace it, that is the conflict, in such a way that they become its prisoners. They lose their bearings, I think he means their objectivity, project onto institutions their own confusion and dissatisfaction, and thus make unity impossible. Now, I call that the way of antagonism. And thirdly, the Pope says, but there is a third way, and it's the best way to deal with conflict. It is the willingness to face it head on, to resolve it, and to make it a link in the chain of a new process. And I call this the way of dialogue. And when I was looking at my notes, it struck me that this is what Pope Francis is now advocating as the synodal way. That we should dialogue about all the issues that divide us and have shared wisdom, not just the bishops and the priests making decisions, but having the lay people as baptized children of God in whom the Holy Spirit is working to make their invaluable contribution. So I think again the Pope is prophetic in saying that the way forward is the way of dialogue, the synodal way. And we've nothing to fear from the synodal way if it's conducted within the bounds of orthodoxy. Now, in the remainder of this talk, I want to share some of the insights that I have gleaned over the years in order to reflect on what Pope Francis has said. They are transferable to person conflicts, perhaps a husband and a wife, but they're also transferable to relationships in the wider family and with relatives who can be such a pain in the neck. They're transferable to our work situation, in which often we'll have to deal with conflict. Certainly they can be relevant in the parish and with members of our prayer communities and so on. Now, for the sake of explaining what is involved, I'm going to take a rather naive example, but it will serve our purpose nevertheless. Let's say, for the sake of example, that John agrees to meet Mary at a well-known landmark in the city or in the town, and he's going to meet her at 3 p.m. That has been arranged. John is conscientious and he arrives at 2:45. But he's looking at his watch after 3 o'clock because there's no sign of Mary. And then she saunters up to the meeting place at 4:20. And she says with a smile, "Sorry I'm late, John. I went into a number of shops and forgot about the time. I hope you don't mind." So here's our little conflict. You see, how does John react to this situation? Now, if we take the example, do you remember Pope Francis said there's the way of avoidance? It's almost denying that there's a problem. So in response to Mary's rhetorical question, "I hope you don't mind," John could respond quite unrealistically by saying, "No, it's okay." Now, the reaction could be due to the fact that he believes in peace at any price, or hates any type of confrontation, or lacks the confidence to assert his legitimate needs and feelings. Although he represses his understandable anger, it doesn't go away. By the way, can I make a little psychological observation here? When you repress anger and put it into your unconscious, you don't feel any anger, but you have the emotion of anger. And you can prove that scientifically by putting electrodes on the person and taking their pulse and so on. And the fact that they're angry will leak out through their body, although they genuinely don't feel any anger because it's been repressed. However, repressed anger leaks out through unhealthy attitudes and behaviors. So the anger will express itself one way or the other. And so when Mary gives John a hug, he is stiff and reserved. And when the two of them go to have a cup of coffee, John talks to Mary in a rather impersonal way without any emotional warmth or empathy. He does make a few humorous observations, but they are insensitive. And when Mary looks a bit hurt, he says, "Your problem is that you can't take a joke." By the way, this is a classic male way of expressing anger. They make a joke at your expense, and when you don't see the joke or don't appreciate it, they say, "Oh, you've no sense of humor." But actually they're stabbing you. It's quite, well, it may not be deliberate, it's unconscious, but it's the anger coming out. Later, when Mary proposes that they go to the cinema together, John replies by saying, no, I can't go because unfortunately I have to go home early, which strictly speaking isn't true at all. He's just avoiding her. God, when I read this, I feel I'm reading some of my own autobiography, but anyway. You know, if you're brought up in a home where I never saw my mother and father ever angry with one another, just never. It was extraordinary. And I suppose people would have thought it was very virtuous, but it wasn't. It meant that they were suppressing a lot of their anger. But guess what the result is? The children don't feel free to express their anger. So I learned to suppress my anger when I was a child. I felt it was immoral. And even the Bible said if you're angry with your brother, you know, you deserve to be brought before the tribunal. Now, there's nothing wrong with anger. Actually, it's very healthy. But I learned to repress it. So there'll be some of us here who always repress their anger, or nearly always do. But that doesn't mean it's gone away. It just means it's going to leak out in other ways that you don't recognize. You know, you'll do antisocial things. Now, let's look at the way of antagonism. John could express his anger in a negative and aggressive way. In response to Mary's rhetorical question, I hope you don't mind, he could respond by saying, you make me angry. I made sure I would be here on time by coming a quarter of an hour early. Oh, but not you. You don't give a damn about anyone. You swan around the shops because it suits you, and then arrive 40 minutes late, leaving Muggins to wait for you for nearly an hour. Now there's the way of antagonism. There's the anger, but you notice it's all blaming Mary, and then Mary says, will we go and have a cup of coffee together? And it'll be my treat, she says. John replies rather sharply by saying, no, I don't feel like it. I want to visit an electrical shop up the street. He says this, although he knows only too well that Mary finds shops like that uninteresting and boring. Notice that John blames Mary for his anger. He said, you made me angry, or you make me angry. Now, psychologically, he's projecting responsibility for what has happened, and his anger, namely his anger, onto Mary. You're the cause. Now, here's a saying in psychology, and I think it's completely true. While other people can stimulate your anger, the causes lie within. It's a very hard truth to accept. Other people can't cause your anger. They can stimulate it. Where are the causes? They're in me. And often they go back to situations in our childhood. Say I was brought up in a family, I'm child number 4, and I've got older siblings who are very successful, they're articulate, they're assertive. And whenever I tried to talk at the table, it was as if my parents didn't hear me and listened to these more vocal and assertive siblings. Now, what you would feel would be anger and a certain jealousy. Why am I not listened to? Am I unimportant? Now, you could see John, if he came out of a family like that, his anger would be understandable. Here we go again. I'm being ignored, as if I don't count. And you're making me angry because of that. And you'd say, excuse me, John, not true. She stimulated your anger, but the causes lie in your past, because you've never resolved the conflict you have with your brothers and sisters, and how you found it hard to win the attention of your parents. Is that making sense? I mean, you could give multiple examples, but it's just saying, now I want you to internalize that principle. Others may stimulate your anger, but the causes lie within you. So we have to look at ourselves when we're angry and see, where is that anger coming from? Why am I so angry? Is it reasonable? And often it's not reasonable. So that's the way of antagonism. And of course, I need hardly say that that's the kind of approach to relationships and conflicts that separates the people further and further apart. And you know as well as I do that that is a very common way of dealing with conflict. I see it living in community. I can see people who are angry all the time, and they never accept responsibility. They're always blaming others. And it makes life very difficult and unpleasant. And the same can happen in family life and in other relationships. Now, finally, there's the way of dialogue. And this is the one, needless to say, that Pope Francis recommends. So, in response to Mary's rhetorical question, "I hope you don't mind," John could reply, "To tell you the truth, Mary, I feel disappointed, angry, and frustrated. Because you mean a lot to me, I came early so I'd be here on time. But when I had to wait for you for 40 minutes, I felt I couldn't be as important to you as you are to me. I felt let down and taken for granted. Quite frankly, it sounds as if window shopping is more important to you than I am." Notice he's only describing how he feels and why he feels that way. He hasn't said one word of accusation or condemnation. He's reporting what he feels in a very honest and vulnerable way. And actually he's giving her a compliment. You mean so much to me, I came early. And I feel disappointed that you didn't come because I feel I may not mean as much to you as you mean to me. But he's not putting her into a position where she has to react. She can respond now to what he says. And Mary might say in reply, "I can see why you feel hurt and offended. It's true. I put my own interests ahead of yours. John, you deserve better. Please forgive my thoughtlessness. Let's make peace over a cup of coffee. I'd hate you to think that you don't mean a lot to me." And there you see, there's a coming together. Because he has handled the conflict in the right way. He's given her space to respond in a humble and reconciling way. And what you often find is when you have conflicts and you resolve them in that way, you feel closer to the person after the conflict than you did before. It's a form of intimacy. It's not intimacy. The word intimacy means to reveal that which is innermost. Intimare, from Latin. And what John has revealed is what he feels deep down. But he's revealing what he feels about Mary. And that gives Mary a chance to explain what she feels about John. So the conflict actually becomes an opportunity for more intimate relationships. And that's why they end up more united after the conflict than perhaps they were before it took place. And I think many of us adults here, when we think back on our lives and big conflicts we had with other adults who were important to us, that when we resolved the issues in a Christian way, by means of dialogue, we did actually strengthen the relationship rather than weaken it. So it's no big deal if you have conflicts in a community once you know how to handle them in a constructive way. Now I just want to say some further points about handling conflicts of this kind. Rather than being a dysfunctional way, that it is constructive. Now, one thing that I think is important is that when you're in a conflict, do not start with the pronoun you. Now, and usually we're pointing, you didn't turn up on time. Now, when you see a pointing finger, it's usually a sign that the person is judging you and condemning you. So if you want to resolve conflicts in a Christian way, in a mature human way, you start with the pronoun I. Now, you see, John started with the pronoun I in our third example, the way of dialogue. But John would have started with the word you when it was the aggressive approach. You didn't turn up because you don't give a damn. Or you swan around as if you're the center of the universe and you forgot all about me. See, there's judgment and condemnation. Now, normally when you feel judged and condemned, you go on the defense and you usually attack back. Well, you're no paragon of virtue, and you quote something from his life from the past when you felt let down. See, so it's kind of a war. So, if you're going to communicate in a constructive way that leads to reconciliation, instead of starting with you, start with I. By the way, people have said, and there's some truth in it, when you say you and you're pointing with one finger, there are three other fingers pointing back at yourself. And it reminds me of the parable, that sometimes we see the splinter in our brother or our sister's eye while failing to see the plank in our own. And I'm very keen on Jungian psychology and some of its insights. And Carl Jung was of the opinion that we see and criticize in others what we fail to see or accept in ourselves. See, that we project our own shadow out onto the people that we're criticizing. And did you notice Pope Francis said that the way of antagonism is that our conflicts are transferable. Or no, that's not what he said. We project onto institutions our confusion. That we project onto others what we fail to see or accept in ourselves. This is a distraction, but you'll get this in families, for example. The father notices in a family, he has a number of children, that his wife is much more strict with one of her daughters than she is with any other members of the family. She gives out to her, she is more demanding on that daughter, and the husband kind of says, listen dear, I think you're too hard on Mary. I mean, you come down on her like a ton of bricks. Now, the mother might say, oh well, she's a willful child and I have to try and straighten her out. Now, what's really going on is Mary is so like the mother that she's projecting her shadow onto her, and she's treating Mary the way that she isn't accepting that she would need maybe to be treated herself. So it's a big problem in human relationships. And anyway, we also project our shadow onto minority groups. So what group in England today are English people projecting their shadow onto? Migrants. So we project onto them all that we fail to see or accept in ourselves. They are carriers of the shadow, and we want to kick them and abuse them. And if you were living in the United States, you could say who's carrying the shadow, and it's arguable people of colour carry the shadow in the United States. In Northern Ireland, the Protestants will project their shadow onto the Roman Catholics. And I got so friendly with some Protestants, they would forget I was a Catholic. And I'd be in a car with them, and they would literally say, we're driving through a black area at the moment. Now, they didn't mean the colour black. It meant these are the less than human people. They're not like us. See, they're projecting their shadow onto them. But of course, I've often been with Catholics going through Protestant areas. We're going through a black area at the moment. So we not only do individuals project their shadow onto others, but whole groups do it. And that's where it's a bigger subject that we can deal with this afternoon, but we have to deal with reconciliation in the nation between the majority and these minorities who are carriers of the shadow. So start with the pronoun I. And that was John's approach, as I say, in the third example. Secondly, in conflict situations, try to avoid the gravitational pull of what psychologists call self-absorption. That we are only seeing our own point of view. We fail utterly to see the point of view of the other side. By the way, I was listening to an interview on Irish radio. No, it was on the BBC, I think. Anyway, I was listening to an interview with a Jewish journalist from Jerusalem. And he said, I feel ashamed of my nation because we have lost all empathy for the Palestinians. We have no feeling for them in their sufferings and all the deaths that they're experiencing. The only people we have feeling for are fellow Jews. Now, once empathy dies, you're in real trouble, because all kinds of horrors can take place when you feel nothing for your opponent. And so when we're in conflict situations, yes, you have your legitimate point of view, but so has the other person. They too have their story. And you need empathy in conflict situations. It's very difficult. But an ability to stop just thinking about yourself and being so self-preoccupied and opening up to what does he or she feel and why do they feel the way they do. I was just remembering before the workshop began that there's a very interesting text in Philippians chapter 2 where St. Paul says this: make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and purpose. Now here's the real point. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Now, how often do you feel that in a conflict situation? I'm right, you're wrong. No, not considering the other person. I'm better. You're the one who's at fault. Now, we have to take off our own moccasins, so to speak, and put on the shoes of the other person and see things from their point of view and to understand why they feel the way they do. And if we were to do an empathy test on all of you this afternoon, some of you would get a shock because your ability to empathize is virtually zero. Because you suffer from self-absorption, constant self-absorption. Now, often it's due to unresolved hurts in your life, that you have such an emotional toothache that you can't think about anybody else. The only person you ever think about is yourself. It's very narcissistic. It's excessive self-reference. Now, when people are in a conflict, they have to strive, if they're Christians. Yes, I have my point of view and it's legitimate, and I will assert it by reporting how I feel and why I feel the way I do. But I'm going to listen to you and try and sense what you feel and understand why you feel the way you do. And it's when we do that that we're much more likely. And I think that's what happened in our example 3. John explains how he feels, Mary listens, and she responds appropriately. And so there's reconciliation. But it's easy for me to talk about this, but how often do we do this in practice? I am besieged with phone calls every day of the week, 365 days of the year. And it's mostly about people who are full of anxiety and depression because they're living in dysfunctional relationships where there's conflict all the time, and where people are cursing one another and they're putting stuff on the social media which is wrong and very hurtful and judgmental. And it is scandalous and it is remote from being a Christian. But it's almost the order of the day at the moment. Now we have to do better, because if we cannot be reconciled, if we cannot be one in mind and heart, we have no right to cry and go out and give news, good news to others, because we don't have it at home. See, good news is, I've got a good news message about love, and here's my community. We epitomize what I'm saying. We're energized to say what we're saying. But often what we're doing is contradicting what we're saying. And is it any wonder that our evangelization would fall on deaf ears? So, in conflict situations, hurt may have been caused either as a result of ignorance, weakness, or even malice. But if one person has been the cause of our hurt, it's important to humbly acknowledge, I am at fault here. Now, God, as a man, I find this extremely difficult, to back down and admit I was the one who made the mistake. And the Bible says, leave your gift before the altar and go first, be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come back and offer your gift. So that, God, it's a very strong word. Don't be going to Mass if you've hurt somebody and you haven't asked them for their forgiveness. I've had people walk out of churches when they heard me saying this, and they drove hundreds of miles to people and said, I admit I was wrong. And they don't say, I'm sorry that you feel hurt. That's not accepting any responsibility. It is, I'm sorry that you were hurt by me, and I ask you, will you give me the gift of your forgiveness? Now, they may tell you to F off. But at least you've done your best to be reconciled. You know, and St. Paul says somewhere in Romans 12, live at peace with everyone insofar as you can. If people will not return your greeting of peace, that's now their problem. You've done your duty. You've tried to be reconciled. And it's not inevitable that they will accept the hand of friendship and reconciliation. So there are all these things we can do to improve relationships. I just want to add in something that wasn't in my notes, but we founded a prayer group in Northern Ireland back in the early 1970s. And later we founded what we called a community group. There were about 16 of us in it. And each week we would report on what insights we had gotten when we were praying during the week. And one of the women who came to our meeting, she said, I was very impressed by a text in Luke chapter 6, I think it's verse 36. Be merciful as God is merciful. Judge not and you will not be judged. Condemn not and you will not be condemned. Forgive and you will be forgiven. Give and you will receive. Pressed down in full measure, flowing over into your lap. For the measure that you give is the measure that you will receive. Having read the passage, she went silent for a little while. Everyone was hanging on her every word. And then she said, I promise everyone here that I will never judge you or condemn you in thought or word. And if I break my covenant, I will confess it publicly and seek your forgiveness. Now, I had the shivers going up and down my back because I knew she meant it. After a while, all 16 of us were kneeling on the floor. We had all made the covenant. And do you know, none of us ever had to confess in public that we had broken it. And it had an extraordinary effect upon our group. Our praise increased. The gifts of the Holy Spirit were poured out upon us, and we were given opportunities to evangelize that we never had before. We saw signs and wonders happening. And it was all because we grew in unity of mind and heart due to our covenant. No, I'll never judge you. I'll never condemn you in thought or word. When I was made a superior in my religious community, I wondered, would this work with the guys, And I didn't really think it would. But I explained what I had in mind, and to my utter amazement, they said, we agree. We'll sign an agreement that we will never judge or condemn one another in thought or in words. And you know something? We kept it. And our community was completely blessed. So consider, are you in a prayer group, or are you a husband or wife? Could you agree to fast, not from food or drink, but fast from judgment and condemnation? Because if you do, a revolution will take place, and unity of mind and heart will increase. And when you'll have more desire to preach the gospel, and when you do, it'll be more credible, and it will win converts, and the signs and wonders will follow. That's what we're finding in Dublin. So thank you for listening. And we've looked at our 3 ways of dealing with conflict: the way of avoidance, the way of antagonism, and the way of dialogue. And I want to end this part of our afternoon by quoting something that came to my mind. It's from the great Lutheran pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, from his wonderful book called Life Together, which is about discipleship. He says, many people are looking for an ear that will listen. They do not find it among Christians, because these Christians are talking where they should be listening. But he who can no longer listen to his brother or sister will soon be no longer listening to God either. Anyone who thinks that his time is too valuable to spend keeping quiet will eventually have no time for God or his brother or sister, but only for himself and for his own follies. How true. We've got 2 ears. Yes, with one we listen to ourselves, but with the other we listen to the brother or sister with empathy, with understanding, and in doing so, we're indirectly listening to God. So thank you for listening, and we're going to say goodbye now to our listeners, and we will continue here to discuss the matters that have arisen during the talk.